Welcome to part 3 of my series where I'm ranking all 256 combinations of Twinborn types from Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series. In this video, I'll be ranking 16 more Twinborn combinations. As always, some of these names come from the Mistborn adventure game Alloy of Law rulebook, but most of them were created by me and other users in the Exploring the Cosmere Discord channel. If you'd like to help create Twinborn names for future parts of this series, join the Discord. It will be linked in the description below. Without further ado, let's start tier ranking these Twinborn types. The first Twinborn combination we have is Power Napper. Power Nappers can use Allomantic Bindalloy to speed up time in a bubble around them, and they can use their Ferrochemical Bronze to store Wakefulness. Wakefulness is the only ferrochemical attribute that can be stored while the ferrochemist sleeps. That's pretty useful. I'm trying to think if these two powers build on one another in any way. Maybe the Power Napper could throw up a speed bubble around themselves and then start storing their wakefulness. But as Sazed said in Mistborn Era 1, when you're storing your wakefulness, you go into a coma-like state. So I don't know if you could continue to burn your Bindalloy while you're storing your wakefulness or not. But if you are able to keep burning it while you're storing your wakefulness and go into this coma-like state, then it could actually be a pretty good combination. Because when you're in your Bindalloy speed bubble, everything outside that bubble looks like it's moving in slow motion. So theoretically, you could throw up your bubble, store your wakefulness for 8 hours, and then whenever you wake up and drop your speed bubble, maybe only a half an hour passed outside of that speed bubble. So from an outside perspective, it would look like you rapidly filled up your bronze mind. That's the only real added benefit that I can think of that these two powers would add to one another. And I can't really confirm that that would work. So I'm gonna just put Power Napper in B tier. Next up, we have Receptor. Receptors can use their Allomantic Bronze to hear Allomantic pulses, and they can use their Ferrochemical Aluminum to store their identity. Now, aluminum is one of the ferrochemical metals that we don't really know very much about. So here is the Ars Arcanum from the Lost Metal. It says, true self-fairings can store their spiritual sense of identity in an aluminum metal mind. This is an art rarely spoken of outside of terrorist communities, and even among them, it is not yet well understood. We get some more detail in the Bands of Mourning, chapter 3. In this chapter, Wax, Wayne, and Marasi are talking to Vendel, the Kandra, about the different ferrochemical metals. Vendel tells them that ferrochemists' metal minds are keyed to that ferrochemist's identity. Then they start talking about ferrochemical aluminum. Marasi asks, so if a person could store their identity, as Waxilium does with his weight, then Vendel says, they'd be without it for a time, a blank slate, so to speak. Then Marasi asks, so they could use anyone's metal mind? Vendel says possibly. Apparently some have been experimenting with that idea, and the results are promising, so that's really cool. So a receptor might be able to store their identity and use anybody else's metal mind. They could steal ferrochemical attributes from other ferrochemists. That's pretty handy. Ferrochemical aluminum is also used for making unkeyed metal minds, but the ferrochemist has to have access to another ferrochemical power other than just aluminum. That allows them to store their identity while they're filling another metal mind, and that second metal mind will be unkeyed. But in this tier list, I'm assuming that these Twinborn only have access to these two powers. So I don't think that these two powers really build on one another in any way. I'm gonna put Receptor in B tier as well for now, but I might change that placement as we go on. Next up, we have Firefly. Fireflies can use their Allomantic Aluminum to wipe internal Allomantic reserves and their ferrochemical brass to store warmth. As I've talked about in other parts of this series, Twinborn who have aluminum or duralumin as their allomantic ability are basically glorified fairings because their allomantic ability doesn't do much for them. In the case of duralumin, they actually can't use it at all. But Twinborn with allomantic aluminum can use their ability somewhat. Based on this WOB, Brandon says that an Allomancer burning aluminum could negate the withering effects of shades from Threnody, and I've seen a lot of you guys speculate in the comment section that an aluminum Allomancer could burn their aluminum to negate other forms of investiture as well, such as the lashings from a Knight's Radiant. I can't find any information on that. If any of you know of a WOB or another source that states that, post it in the comment section so I can talk about it in another another of these parts. Since Fireflies basically can only use one of their powers unless they're in a very niche circumstance, I'm gonna have to put Firefly pretty low. And I just realized I forgot to add the busted tier. So yes, we usually have the busted tier at the very top. There it is, added. Firefly is gonna go pretty low. I think in other parts I put it in C tier because at least you can do something with your aluminum, but I'm gonna drop it down to B tier going forward. Next up, we have Prowler. Prowlers can use their allomantic bronze to hear allomantic pulses, and they can use their ferrochemical cadmium to store breath. Not the biochromatic breath though, just regular breath, as in oxygen. All right, I actually think that these two powers build on one another pretty nicely. It's a good combination. As long as they have enough breath stored up, they can be actively drawing on their cadmium mind, and then they can forego breathing, and they can be extremely quiet. And then they can sneak up on their prey that they're seeking out using their allomantic bronze. I could see Prowler Twinborn being good assassins or mercenaries, people that need to sneak up on their prey. But yeah, I like this combination. I'm gonna put Prowler in A tier. Next up, we have Bond Seeker. Bond Seekers can use their allomantic bronze to hear allomantic pulses, and they can use their ferrochemical duralumin to store connection. So I don't think that these necessarily build on one another, but they can be used effectively together. A Bond Seeker might seek out other allomancers, and then they can draw on their connection to be very friendly and make those other allomancers want to join their team. I could see them being similar to Kelsier, the leader of an allomantic crew, whether they use their allomancy for criminal purposes like Kelsier or for good purposes. I guess that depends on their morals. Bond Seeker is a pretty good Twinborn combination. I will put them in, I don't know if they're S tier. I'll put them in S tier for now. Next up, we have Dilator. Dilators can use their allomantic cadmium to slow down time, and they can use their ferrochemical bind alloy to store energy. Using these two powers in combination, the Dilator could skip forward in time, technically, by throwing up their cadmium bubble and staying in it for extended periods of time and just living off of the nutrition that they have stored in their bind alloy mines. You can store both nutrition from food and you can store fluids in bind alloy mines. You just have to have a separate one for each. So when you're in the cadmium bubble, everything outside the cadmium bubble from your perspective looks like it's going rapidly. But from an external observer looking at you in your cadmium bubble, it looks like you're barely moving. All your movements are very, very slow. For the right type of person, this would be a very good combination. If somebody wants to skip forward in time and experience the world in different eras, it kind of reminds me of the cryogenic freezing in the 3-body problem. If any of you have read that series, you'll know what I mean. I think Dilator is a pretty cool combination. I can't put it in S tier though. It has very niche use. So I'm gonna put it in A tier. I'm gonna put it in front of Prowler. And remember guys, if you don't agree with my placements, let me know your reasonings why down in the comments. Next up we have Steadfast. Steadfasts can use their allomantic cadmium once again to slow down time in a bubble around them, and they can use their ferrochemical electrum to store determination. I don't see these abilities being very good when combined. They don't add anything to one another. I guess a Steadfast could throw up their cadmium bubble and tap their determination at the same time, and they would be extremely determined to just stay in that cadmium bubble for extended periods of time. If they had a bunch of supplies with them in that cadmium bubble, then they could probably do something similar to the Dilator and just skip forward in time, just experience the world in different eras, but it wouldn't be as easy for them. I don't really like ferrochemical electrum very much myself. I usually rank it kind of low. I think I'm gonna have to rank it pretty low again. These two powers just don't build on each other in any meaningful way that I can see, so I'm putting in C tier. Next up, we have Deadweight. Deadweights can use their allomantic chromium to wipe the allomantic reserves of a target, and they can use their ferrochemical iron to store their physical weight. For allomantic chromium, the Deadweight can go up to another allomancer who has allomantic reserves already ingested. They can lay their hand on that other allomancer, burn their chromium, and the other allomancer's allomantic reserves will vanish. Iron is a pretty good ferrochemical power because it can be very beneficial to both store your weight and to tap your weight. If you're falling from a very high height, you can store a bunch of your weight to lower your mass, but since your surface area remains the same, your fall will actually slow to the point where you can land safely without being hurt. And then of course, when you're drawing on your physical weight later, you can add mass to all of your hits during combat. You can make it so you're harder to move. We saw Sazed use it in Era 1 during the Battle of Luthadel to hold the city gates closed when the Koloss were trying to burst through. But I don't think these two powers combine very well. They don't build on one another, but they are both good powers to have. I think I'm gonna put Deadweight in B tier. I'll put it mid B tier. Next up, we have Ghostwalker. Ghostwalkers can use their allomantic copper to hide allomantic pulses, and they can use their ferrochemical aluminum to store identity. This name comes from the Mistborn adventure game Alloy of Law rulebook, and Ghostwalkers have the reputation of seemingly being beneath everyone's notice. Okay, so I don't think that these powers work together very well. At first glance, it seems like they do, and based on that reputation, it seems like they do. But storing your identity in ferrochemical aluminum doesn't actually make you less noticeable to others. The attribute that makes you less noticeable to others is actually connection, which is stored in a Duralumin mind. So yeah, I don't think that these two powers really build on one another. I'm gonna put Ghostwalker in C tier above Steadfast. Next up, we have Starpolar. Starpolars can use their allomantic iron to pull metals, and they can use their ferrochemical bronze to store wakefulness. Okay, so these powers don't really work together either. I mean, I guess maybe a Starpolar could be a good bodyguard that needs to stay up for multiple shifts. They could store up a bunch of their wakefulness during their off time and then just tap that wakefulness during their extended shift. And then they could use their allomantic iron to pull projectiles towards themselves rather than the person they're protecting. But yeah, other than that, I don't really see these powers working together. Starpolar is just gonna go in B tier for me. And you know what? I'm actually gonna move Ghostwalker up to B tier as well. I don't think it deserves C tier. Next, we have Recaller. Recallers can use their allomantic iron to pull on metals, and they can use their ferrochemical copper to store memories. Both of these are pretty good powers. They're pretty useful, but they don't build on one another once again. Maybe a Recaller could be a pretty good warrior. They could store all kind of information about fighting in their copper mind, and they could use their iron to disarm their foes. I'm gonna put Recaller in B tier behind Starpolar and in front of Receptor. Next up, we have Worla Gig. Worla Gigs can use their allomantic aluminum to wipe internal allomantic reserves, and their ferrochemical cadmium allows them to store breath. So this is another glorified fairing, essentially. They're the gnats of the Twinborn world. Yeah, I'm not going to spend too much time on this since they almost can never use their allomantic power. They have to go D tier for me. I think I'm going to put them behind Firefly. Next up, we have Scalers. Scalers can use their allomantic iron to pull on metals, and they can use their ferrochemical pewter to store physical strength. This name comes from the Mistborn adventure game rulebook. It says that their reputation is scale buildings with great speed and grace. Okay, so Scalers would be kind of like a Spider-Man type. As their reputation says, they could scale up buildings with ease. I could see them climbing up a skyscraper, for instance, using their allomantic iron to pull on metal sources above them. And when there's no metal sources above them, they could rely on their ferrochemical pewter and increase their muscle mass and their strength and just dig into the material potentially and continue their climb. Storing in your pewter mind makes your muscles shrivel up. So it kind of has a similar effect of storing your weight in an iron mind, but to a lesser degree. So when you're storing your physical strength, it would technically make you slightly lighter, and you'd be able to pull yourself upwards with your allomantic iron easier. And vice versa, whenever you're tapping your pewter mind and drawing on that physical strength, your muscles grow. So you'd be heavier, and that would also make your iron more effective if you're trying to pull something towards you or pull something down. Going back to how Scalers would be kind of like Spider-Man, you could also use your allomantic iron to swing from metal sources like a imagine streetlights. I mean, you could jump in the air and pull on the streetlight slightly to make your momentum go forward and swing from street lamp to street lamp, essentially. Yeah, I think Scalar is a pretty good combination, actually. I'll put it in S tier behind Bondseeker. Next up, we have Jolter. Jolters can use their Allomantic Nigrosil to enhance the Allomantic burn of a target, and they can use their Ferrochemical Steel to store physical speed. Alright, so this is actually a pretty good combination of metals. So to use your Allomantic Nigrosil, you lay your hand on another Allomancer, and if that other Allomancer is burning metals, that whole reserve of metals will be burned up in an instant. So Nigrosil can be used to support other Allomancers if you're on a team of Allomancers, but it can also be used for combat reasons. For instance, if you know that somebody is a tin eye and they're burning their tin, you can burn your Nigrosil when you're touching them and it will overload their senses. It can disorient them and make them blind for a bit. Now, couple that with Ferrochemical Speed, the Jolter can be tapping their speed mine to sprint from ally to ally, quickly providing an extra Allomantic boost to their Allomancy. And they could also quickly zip over to an enemy Allomancer and force that Allomancer to use up their entire Allomantic reserve at once. So yes, Jolters could be really good for both support and offensive purposes. So yeah, I think Jolter is a good combination and it's gonna go in S tier. Next up, we have Battery. Batteries can use their Allomantic Steel to push metals, and they can use their Ferrochemical Bronze to store wakefulness. This is very similar to Star Polar, except you push on metals instead of pull on the metals. I think a battery could fill a similar role as a Star Polar. Maybe they would be good bodyguards, or I guess Allomantic Steel is a little more offensive than Allomantic Iron. So maybe a battery could be a warrior, somebody that goes into battle and is able to stay in the fight for extended periods of time as long as they have enough wakefulness stored up. But I don't think they really build on each other. I think I'm gonna put Battery in C tier. And now that I think about it, I will drop Star Polar down to C tier as well. It's gonna go behind Battery. The last Twinborn combination for this video is Sharpshooter. Sharpshooters can use their Allomantic Steel to push metals, and they can use their Ferrochemical Tin to store senses. This name comes from the Mistborn adventure game rulebook, and they have the reputation of being crack shots and deadly gunfighters. I think Sharpshooter is a pretty good combination. You could definitely see a lot further if you're tapping your sight from one of your tin mines. So you could probably use your Allomantic Steel to push metals rapidly towards enemies at a great distance, as long as you're strong enough with your Allomantic Steel, that is. I could also see it coming in handy to increase your senses when you're jumping around with your steel pushes and you're in the air. You could see things way down below you on the ground with greater detail than you would normally. You can also store your sense of touch in a tin mine, which kind of deadens your nerves. So you could probably get into a gunfight and take a few hits without even feeling the pain. And that would help you continue to focus on the fight. I don't know. I mean, that would be a pretty dangerous use, but it could be useful. Sharpshooter will go at the top of A tier. So looking these over, I think I'm going to actually drop Prowler down to B tier. Alright, so there is my final ranking for this week. None of the combinations from this week's video made it into the busted tier. This is of course just my thoughts on these combinations. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Here's the combined tier list from all the parts of the series so far. If you enjoy my content, consider supporting the channel by becoming a channel member or a patron. Supporters at the Arcanist tier and higher will get access to high quality versions of these graphics I use for these tier list videos. That's it for this video, guys. I'll see you in part 4.